Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. On 29th February, the United States and the Taliban signed a historic deal which could pave the way for peace in Afghanistan. For the US, the deal marks the beginning of the end of a 19-year-long presence of US and allied troops in Afghanistan. Remember, the US invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, barely a month after the 11th September 2001 terror attacks in New York. So what does the text of the deal say? Can the world count on the Taliban to deliver on its commitments? What will happen to Afghanistan after the US exits the country? And what are the implications of the deal for India? Two eminent guests join me in the studio to answer those and related questions so that you, the viewer, know what it takes to be on top of the news. Let me introduce them to you. Ambassador TCA Raghavan. He is the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, and Colonel DPK Pillay, a research fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analyses. Now, Ambassador Raghavan is a former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. He held several other positions during his long and distinguished career in the Indian Foreign Service, including Joint Secretary in charge of the Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iran desk in the Indian Foreign Ministry. He is also an accomplished author, and if I might add, Ambassador Raghavan was one of two persons nominated by the Indian government to take part in the November 2018 talks between the Taliban and the Afghan High Peace Council hosted by Moscow. And Colonel Pillay spent 29 years in the Indian Army. He earned a Shaurya Chakra for gallantry beyond the call of duty in Tamenglong, Manipur, where he is remembered for an evacuation of wounded children despite having himself received life-threatening injuries. In December 2018, Colonel Pillay joined as a military advisor with the ICRC and for after-action review for the wars in Iraq, Syria and Yemen. In fact, he was the first Indian Armed Forces officer selected as an Armed Forces delegate with the ICRC. Now, first I want to bring you up to date on the news so far. The US signed a deal with the Taliban on 29th February. It sets the stage for ending America's longest war, the nearly two-decade-old conflict in Afghanistan that began after the 11th September attacks. US envoy Zalmay Khalilzad and Taliban deputy leader Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar inked the deal in Qatar's capital, Doha. Now, the US Foreign Minister Mike Pompeo witnessed the signing of the agreement. Addressing the gathering, which included India's ambassador to Qatar, both parties committed to a timetable for the final withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. Pompeo said that the US will calibrate the pace of withdrawal from Afghanistan with Taliban's actions.
Closely watch the Taliban's compliance with their commitments and calibrate the pace of our withdrawal to their actions. This is how we will ensure that Afghanistan never again serves as a base for international terrorists. The negotiation process in Doha, with all of its twists and turns, has shown it is possible for us to take this step together.
Now, on the occasion, Taliban Deputy Leader Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar resolved to work with the international community.
The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban and the United States, successful negotiations and the agreement for the Mujahid nation of Afghanistan, and is also good for the international community. I congratulate everyone for that achievement. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, with the United States, the agreement that it has reached, we are committed to this agreement to enforce it. Also, we want, as a political force, to maintain with its neighbors, regional countries and international community, we want a positive relationship with all.
Now, Qatar, which mediated the deal between the Taliban and the US, said that both the parties are committed to the peace deal for a prosperous Afghanistan.
Peace agreement signed on its territory between the United States of America and Taliban after long phases of difficult negotiations until it was crowned with success. Achieving the sought peace in this agreement and building successful and fruitful relations between the two parties requires a mutual understanding by each party of the other party's preoccupations, as well as an honest will to achieve the best interests of everyone. And this can only happen through creating a conducive environment to implement this agreement and reach the final settlement between the two parties.
Now, meanwhile, Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has rejected a Taliban demand for the release of 5,000 prisoners as a condition for talks with the Afghan government and civilians included in a deal between the U.S. and the Taliban. His remarks come against the backdrop of the difficulties U.S. negotiators face in shepherding the Afghan government and the Taliban towards intra-Afghan negotiations. The accord said the United States and the Taliban were committed to work expeditiously to release combat and political prisoners as a confidence-building measure with the coordination and approval of all relevant sides. The deal said that up to 5,000 jailed Taliban would be released in exchange for up to 1,000 Afghan government captives by 10th of March. All right, if I can go to my guest for the discussion, Ambassador Raghavan, if I can come to you first. Your thoughts on the deal between the U.S. and the Taliban, and what do you make of the implications of this deal for the region and the world at large?
Well, it's very clear that this agreement comes at the culmination of a prolonged process of negotiation which has been pushed by two factors. Firstly, the overwhelming desire for all shades of opinion in Afghanistan for peace and stability to return to that country after decades of internal strife and external intervention. And secondly, the very evident requirement and desire of the United States to withdraw from its longest overseas military commitment and military intervention. So these two factors explain this agreement in broad terms. The implications for India, I think the implications not just for India but for the whole region and in fact for the whole world will unfold in the months to come. But what is very clear is that return to peace and stability in Afghanistan is something which is and has always been in our long-term interest. And to the extent that this agreement catalyzes an intra-Afghanistan dialogue which enables parties which are bitterly opposed to each other to come together on a common platform is something which I believe the government has welcomed, and it should welcome, because this is something which has been our long-standing policy and long-standing posture with regard to Afghanistan.
Indeed, you raised a number of valid points, Ambassador Raghavan. If I can come to you now, Colonel Pillay, from a military standpoint, how would you react or respond to this deal with the Taliban?
It's very interesting to note the terms of the deal is that the Taliban wouldn't allow its territories to be used against. So the very fact that this attack against the Taliban was launched on the basis of an attack that was carried out, and you're negotiating with the same set of people, that just shows a wasted 2 decades, 18 years and trillions of dollars, and you get back to the same negotiating, just shows how flawed their entire thing. But the world today is not what it was in 1990 when they withdrew, and then we suffered a lot. Indians suffered. We had like I was serving in Kashmir at that time, we had a large influx of, those were the early days of insurgency there, and we had a large number of foreign fighters and trained in Pakistan, already battle hardened. And Pakistan, if you note, was the poster boy for the whole of the world, because they were the frontline state for the fight against the Soviet Union, and they were the champions of having, defeated a superpower by a motley gang of the Taliban, the Mujahideen. And now Pakistan learned a lot of lessons then in how to use guerrilla and terror against established army, and they employed that effectively against us. Ziaul Haq unleashed bleeding us by 1,000 cut kind of a campaign. And we saw the influx of large number of foreign trained militants coming in 1990, 1991, and we were not prepared. We were not like what we are today. The world has changed much over the last, much since the decades of 1990, where we were caught unawares and we had those sieges that are taking place, and India wasn't what India is today, and Pakistan is not what it was then. Today Pakistan is much impoverished. It sustains itself, and everyone has understood what a succubus Pakistan has been. It has been living off, it is like sucking the American aid and everything, and actually fighting against them. So we are not what we were in 1990, and Pakistan is not what it was. But the Taliban, I think, is also not what it was. You know, it has learned its lessons, if it has, and while it really wouldn't like to unleash its potential in its neighborhood, without even consolidating what's happened inside its own territory. So I think we need to wait and watch what is going to happen here.
Sure.
But I definitely know that this was a deal that should have happened many years ago if you had to actually deal. And I don't see peace really happening once the Americans withdraw, because Taliban I don't think they even understood what was being written in the deal, because they were a government that ran on chits. So I'm not sure whether.
Right, fair point. Ambassador Raghavan, you've been a long-time watcher of South Asia in general and Afghanistan in particular. You've served as India's High Commissioner to Pakistan and also handled the PAI desk in the Foreign Ministry. And you also attended the Moscow talks in November 2018. Now, from your standpoint, in your estimation, what would you say if I were to ask you, can the Taliban be trusted to deliver on its commitments?
Well, I don't think anyone has an answer to that question, because in a sense, all parties, when they reach an agreement, are expected to act in their own interest. This agreement would have been reached on the estimation that this agreement is also in the Taliban's interest, because I'm sure the Taliban, like any other party in Afghanistan, faces a groundswell of popular opinion that they want peace and stability to return to a war-torn country. Can it be trusted? I don't think questions of trust come in so much as questions of interest. And we have to see how these interests are develop and how they are evaluated by different parties. But I think it's important to keep a general point in mind whenever one looks at an agreement of this kind. And it's quite true that these are bitterly opposed entities which are reaching an agreement amongst themselves, that essentially negotiations and peace talks are always held between enemies. And therefore, when we evaluate the agreement they reach, it will be always possible to point out contradictions as compared to past behavior. But as I said, agreements can only be reached between enemies, not between friends. You don't have peace negotiations with friends. And
Sure.
I would say we have to cautiously watch how the situation develops and hope for the best, because Afghanistan is vital for our national security. It is a neighboring country. It is a very important part of our region. And if there is a semblance of hope that there will be more stability because of these two agreements reached, I think we should hope for the best.
Ambassador Raghavan, I want you to parse the text of the agreement to give our viewers the correct subtext and the context for everything that's been discussed between the Taliban and the US. Now, if you go with the text of the agreement or the deal, there is no reference to the constitution of Afghanistan. Now, that's an issue which has been debated for a long time by both Afghanistan and its neighbors, including India. Also, there's no mention of the ceasefire. Now, that's something which will be negotiated going forward. So, is this deal good enough for the region as we speak, and will that hold going forward as well?
Well, as I said, it's impossible to predict what will happen in the future. You are talking about an agreement between parties which are bitterly opposed to each other,
Right.
And in fact are still in a conflict situation, because as you say, there is no ceasefire in place. But it is a step which they have obviously taken because they see it as it being in their interests and in the larger interests of their countries. Will the agreement hold? What are the internal contradictions in it? There are numerous issues. After all, we don't even have to go into so much detail.
Right.
This is an agreement between two parties who do not even recognize each other.
Absolutely.
And the Taliban is mentioned as an entity which the United States government does not recognize. So there are numerous issues of that kind in an agreement. But given the background in which it has taken place, these contradictions are to be expected. And I don't think, while we should not certainly throw all caution to the winds, I don't think we should be necessarily cynical in evaluating it. primarily because, as I said, the United States has been in Afghanistan long enough. It's 19 years. It's their longest overseas military engagement. And secondly, there's an overwhelming desire in Afghanistan for peace and stability.
Indeed. Colonel Pillay, let's delve into the history of the Taliban, if you will. Viewers might remember the Taliban involvement in the 1999 Kandahar hijacking, which left a sour note for Indian officials and Indian government at that point of time. That's lingered on for several years afterwards. From your standpoint, what's the implication for India's security if the Taliban is mainstreamed in Afghanistan in terms of security of our borders, security in Jammu and Kashmir? Will terror groups operating in Afghanistan and Pakistan refocus their attention towards the eastern frontier of Pakistan with India?
Well, if you recall, recently the Corps Commander 15 Corps said that a large number of people are waiting across the borders to be launched in India. So that's, the circumstances have changed. The post 370, Kashmir is a different kettle of fish. There is a forces are on a state of high alert, and we are not what we were again in 1990s. But Taliban had, we had deliberately chosen, we were on the other side. We actually chose to ally with the Northern Alliance in many ways, and we were definitely not on good terms with them. But today, India is not what it was in 89, 90 in Afghanistan. See the large amount of goodwill that has been generated there, and the kind of hospital, the dams, the roads, that Zelaram Road, the Salwa Dam, and the others that are under construction, the large number of hospitals. So even the Taliban understands that, the presence of India is important, because medical expertise and education and others, which I hope they will continue, because post-Taliban, the women have also come out to being educated and things like that. So I really think that the Taliban may not mess around, may not actually, I do hope that they won't really collaborate with the Pakistani, because they have to get hold of their own territories now. It's been 18 years that they've been bombed out of their leadership is, has been decimated in many ways. And so I am not very clear whether they would be really like to focus their energies onto our territories. And while there's a much better way of actually, but given the situation at home, and given that the fact they would intend to govern that country, that territories, or rather than let it to descend into chaos, I'm hopeful that they wouldn't really, and Pakistan should not be able to get, because even Americans, by being there for 18 years, knows in fact, a large number of inputs have arrived from the American side. So they exactly know how deep the Pakistani state runs there, and they have a network. So even after withdrawal that happens after this, I'm sure that the Americans would continue to have assets, the human assets in there. Today it's a networked world. You can sit in mainland USA and kind of carry out your thing. So the intelligence inputs that have been given to us in several cases, and the leads that they have, it's a completely different scenario, and India is in a very different wicket with the Americans today.
Sure.
So,
indeed, Ambassador Raghavan, let's talk a bit about, if you will, about the U.S. Interest in cutting and running away from Afghanistan. Now, we've heard from the Taliban side at the signing ceremony in Doha. The Mullah brother thanked many countries, including China, Iran, Russia, Uzbekistan, Indonesia, Norway and Pakistan. India was not mentioned. So given the history between the Taliban and India, does India look forward to having a working relationship with the government in Afghanistan, given the fact that Taliban may come into a power sharing agreement with President Ghani's government going forward?
Well, in my view, we should try to have good relations with whatever government is formed in Afghanistan, as long as it is legitimately constituted and has the support of all sections of Afghan opinion. I don't think we should evaluate what is going to happen in the future simply on the basis of our experience of the past.
Right.
I think one's experience of the past is something to be always kept in mind, and it is always strikes a note of caution, but it cannot be a guide to what is happening in the future, because on that basis we would be condemned to repeat the past endlessly. And certainly there is the role of Pakistan, and there is a certain Pakistani mindset with regard to Afghanistan and India. But what part of our policy should also always keep in mind is that Pakistan is also not the same country it was in 1990 or in 2000, because they have suffered more than anyone else, or perhaps as much as any other country. The use of the proxies which it has inflicted in Afghanistan and on India. The blowback which Pakistan has suffered, we hope has also enabled it to learn certain experiences from the past, and from learn certain lessons from its experiences and its policies in the past. So I think given the fact that parties which were at war and were in a state of conflict are prepared to take steps forward, I think we should also try to be cautiously optimistic about it.
Indeed. And Colonel, if I can come to you now, the text talks about the American pullout from Afghanistan between now and April 2021. That's a span of 14 months. But Trump has said that it will be a conditions-based approach, meaning thereby that if the Taliban reneges on its commitments, then the US will not adhere to its side of the commitment. But from your standpoint, how do you look at an American pullout from Afghanistan, and how might it affect the fortunes of, say, countries in the neighborhood, especially Pakistan? Will Pakistan see it as an advantage vis-a-vis India going forward?
Yeah, to look at it in a manner, the bang with which they came and the whimper which they are leaving, I think, they haven't achieved what they would have. They haven't decimated, even though Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar and they are no more. But the fact is that a pullout is the best thing that the Americans could actually ask for. It's a face-saving gesture. It's very much like Vietnam, where they've also pulled out without having achieved its aims.
But we saw what happened in Vietnam. So my question to you is, who might fill the vacuum created in Afghanistan after the American pullout? So that's still a gray area, isn't it?
Exactly. And the Afghan forces have been very well trained.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that in Iraq.
Right.
Now, when you had the ISIS takeover, the territories that are recaptured, the ISIS took over the territories very easily. If you remember, about 800 odd people took over the entire swaths of territory in Iraq and other places. But subsequently, Iraqi-led and Iraqi-driven, and that's what we've also been saying. It should be an Afghan-driven, Afghan-led, and Afghan-centered policy. And we always believe that. And I think the fact is that even the Afghan armed forces are quite competent. We've also armed them in large measure. We've trained a large number. They've also received large number of, in fact, much of the $3 trillion that have gone, a large part of it has gone to train the Afghan forces. So today, the Afghan forces is not what Najibullah had under his command. So I do hope, like, there was some voices that the Taliban negotiations took place independent of the Afghan government. Now, we really don't know. See, the nature, there's no, if you see our history, other than Ranjit Singh, who governed that territory for some bit of time in history, otherwise this country has been a country of warlords, and no European power has actually had its control on that place. And now how do the warlords, who among the warlords can actually draw them together and keep them under? It's a matter of time that we actually see. But definitely, we are prepared. We are not what we are in if there's some kind of a misconception on the Pakistani side that they get a leeway to kind of think, they would have kind of a demon in their own hands there in the backyard. It's not something that is going to be easy for them. You remember Masgul, who was the man who laid siege to Charar-e-Sharif, came and turned on the Pakistani forces, and he fought. So these are devils that can go either way. So there's not a so that's we wait and watch.
Sure. I want to pause here and talk about another India Connect story. Now, India's Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla was in Kabul last week. He met almost all the leaders of Afghanistan, including President Ashraf Ghani, Chief Executive Abdullah, Vice President-elect Amrullah Saleh, NSA Hamdullah Mohib, Acting Foreign Minister Harun Chakansuri, and former President Hamid Karzai, among others. On the occasion, India and Afghanistan signed 2 pacts of construction of roads in Bamiyan and Mazar-e-Sharif provinces. Right, Ambassador Raghavan, if I can talk about India's development aid to Afghanistan, what happens to those projects in the light of the deal between the US and Taliban? How secure would those projects be, and will it affect India's interests in that country?
I think there is a common misconception about our aid projects or our investments in Afghanistan. Our aid or our investments were not in the nature of commercial investments in Afghanistan.
Right.
These were really investments in social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, and were in terms of Afghan priorities. I'm pretty sure that no matter who forms the government in Afghanistan, these infrastructure projects will be valued because they are based on Afghan priorities themselves. I believe our biggest investment has been in the friendship of the people of Pakistan, of Afghanistan, and that is something which is non-tangible, non-quantifiable, but will last the longest. To my mind, regardless of which government comes to Afghanistan or what happens in Afghanistan internally and in terms of strife between different interests, the friendship which exists in the amongst the Afghan people for India will endure. And that is the big plus of our relationship with Afghanistan in the past 2 decades. So I wouldn't worry too much about what would happen to these assets which we have created.
All right, on that note, Ambassador Raghavan and Colonel Pillay, thank you so much for joining me in the discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Namaste India.
Namaste land.
مرحبا إلى الهند.
زري إنديا.
سلام إنديا.
Namaste India.
Namaskar Bharata.
Mui
Nous
India.
sommes land.
نحن هنود.
India.
ما هندي هستي.
Mung Hindian.
Salam Hindustan.
We are India.
Nadimarg and Wandhama, which grabbed in 1989